Hello and warm greetings. Welcome to the Analyst by Vajiram and Ravi, where we would try to comprehensively analyze 7 articles in 2 different sections. In the analysis part, we'll first have a comprehensive discussion with respect to the changes taking place in Indian demography, the rising share of elderly population, associated concerns, and the way forward. Then, in the second article, we'll have a look at the serious public safety issue of industrial and chemical disaster, the related causes, and the way forward. Then in the simplified section, we'll have a look at 5 different articles from a special perspective of UPSC Prelims 2026 along with the value addition. So stay tuned. Coming to the very first topic of today's discussion, this is with respect to India's aging crisis. Who will care? We often say that the only constant thing in the world is change. Change is the law of nature. Be it the society, be it the economy, be it the demography, all are subject to change. When I look at the Indian demography, what I see is that there is a transition which is going on. That is, there has been the rising share of elderly population. When I talk about the elderly population, what I'm referring to is the people above the age of 60 years of age. If I were to give you the numbers, according to the census 2011, the share of the elderly population as a proportion of the total population was 8.6%. And according to the United Nations Population Fund Agency, UNFPA, what it says is that this share is going to increase to almost 20% by the year 2050. Almost 1/5 of the total population. Now, this transition has its own social challenges. Because what we are witnessing is frequent cases of neglect, of abuse, of exploitation of this segment of the society. This vulnerable section, what we have is the elderly section. If you just look at this particular news, what it says is that the Haryana Human Rights Commission has intervened in a particular case where you had an elderly couple. We have the 90s, man in his 90s and the women in his 80s. They have been neglected by their own son. And this, the justice, the chairperson of the Haryana Human Rights Commission has said that this basically amounts to the violation of Article 21, right to live with dignity. Also, they have basically talked about a very important statutory framework, which is the Maintenance and Welfare of Parents and Senior Citizens Act of 2007, which says that we have Section 20, which basically mandates the state to provide the healthcare services for the senior citizens, including the reserved hospital beds and subsidized treatments. See, this is how you'll have to look at the news item and basically extract the information which is relevant from the perspective of UPSC, right? Also, there is another section which has been highlighted, which is Section 24 of this same act, which basically talks about and envisages the criminal liability for the abandonment of senior citizens by those responsible for their care. It can be the children's or it can be the near and dear ones. So what we see is this is a very serious social issue. And what we'll do is we'll look at this particular aging phenomena. We'll see why there's a need for elderly care. What are the challenges associated? What have been the government initiatives? And what can be the way forward? This topic is really very important from the perspective of 2 subjects. We have GS1, which talks about the population, demography, and society. And we have GS2, which talks about the vulnerable sections, social sector, welfare schemes. So again, a very, very important topic. Now, as I told you, what we see is when I look at the changes in the Indian demography, what I see is that there has been a rising, an exponential growth with respect to the number and proportion of the old age people. And these are the reasons. We'll have a discussion. Also, I'd like to give a data to you with respect to the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, which says that the dependence ratio has increased quite a lot. In 1961, the dependence ratio was almost to the tune of 11%. And this dependence ratio has increased by the year 2021 to almost 16%. The dependence ratio has increased. So what we see is that the population is aging. Now, as I already gave you the number, so the United Nations Population Fund Agency, the data says that it is going to increase from 10%, around 10% in 2012-13 to almost 19.5% by the year 2050. Almost 1/5 of the total population, right? Also, if you just look at the kind of growth rates we are witnessing in the society, in the demography, what we'll see is that this is the particular color, this color represents the growth rate with respect to the general population. If you see that if I talk about the decades of 2001 till 2011, it was 17.7, right? And it was almost 25.5% for the elderly population. Now, just look at the projected figures for 2021 and 31. This is going to reduce the general population to almost 8.4%. And this, for the elderly population, this is going to increase to 40.5%. Very serious concern. If I were to give you another data, it says the India Aging Report of 2023, the topic was caring for our elders, institutional responses, said that there were almost 149 million, almost 15 crore persons aged 60 years and above in the year 2022, right? Just look at this, another quite interesting infographic, which says 30 years from now, the elderly population in India is expected to triple from 104 million in 2011 to almost 30 crores in 2050. Elderly population in India, around 134 million in 2020, is fast reaching the current size of population of Mexico and Russia. Can you imagine? The total population of Mexico and Russia. Then the 2050 population of elderly will be close to the population of the US in 2018, right? India's 12 million population of 80 plus is equal to the total population of countries such as Belgium, Greece, Cuba. So again, this information is just to give you the picture, what the situation is all about. And yes, definitely you can use these data points in the answers as well. Now, the question is why we are witnessing this particular aging phenomena. There has to be a reason, right? If we are witnessing this thing in the demography, there has to be substantial reason. The very first is increased longevity. Especially after 1990s, what we have witnessed is that there has been a remarkable improvement with respect to the healthcare services. And when I'm talking about the healthcare services, what you need to pay attention is to the fact the public service delivery, the public healthcare delivery systems at the grassroots level, they have significantly improved. See, we have our own challenges with respect to the delivery of the health services, but still it has remarkably improved, and that has led to increased longevity. Also, according to the World Health Organization, what it says is that in the year 2000, the life expectancy was around 62 years, and this has increased to almost 67 years by the year 2021. So there has been almost a 5-year increase in the life expectancy. Then the other points is the improved living condition. When we talk about the living conditions, what I'm referring to is improved conditions with respect to the water, sanitation, hygiene, right? So that ultimately transforms into a situation where less disease burden is there, right? So this becomes important. And we have had our own programs. For example, the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, which focuses specifically upon the water, sanitation and hygiene, right? Next, we have decreased fertility rates. We are already witnessing that in some states, particularly in the southern Indian states, the total fertility rate has gone below the replacement level. In fact, at all India level, according to the National Family Health Survey 5 of 2019-20, what it says is that the TFR rate has gone below the replacement level. The replacement level is 2.1 and it has gone below that, right? Next aspect is socio-economic changes. What I'm referring to is the increased education or the workforce participation, primarily of the women. What we are witnessing is because of the increased education and workforce participation, there is this aspect of delayed marriage, right? And fewer number of children. So that is bringing a change in the demography. Keep all these points in the mind. It would be very helpful. Now, why elderly care is really needed? What are the rational reasons behind it? The very first is channelization of experience. Elderly people have a wide range of experience, be it the personal life, be it the professional life. So we need to channelize their learnings, their experience. So this becomes very important. Next is generational link. When we look at the elders, they are the generational link between our ancestors and the infants or the young population, because they basically transfer that value system from this particular generation to the next generation. So again, vital generational link. Next, social harmony. Why social harmony? Because of the maturity, because of the increased sensibility. The elderly population, the elderly people, they're more inclined to the good values like peace or let's say harmony in the society. So that is very, very important, right? They're not aggressive in nature. Then we talk about the moral and ethical responsibility. We already have GS paper 4, which talks about the ethical aspect. So as a society, it is our ethical responsibility to take care of the elderly. Why? Because these people in their prime age, in their younger times, they contributed a lot to the society, to the economy, to the other segments of the society. So now it is a time that we reciprocate by caring or by providing them the necessary support. So these are the important reasons. Now, let's talk about the provisions related to the elderly population. When we look at the Constitution of India, the very first is Article 41, which talks about the directive principles. We have DPSPs. Now, this gives the directive right to work, to education, to public assistance in certain cases. And in certain cases, it also refers to the old age. Very important. Then we have Article 46, protection of the weaker section of the society, including the SCs, scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, including the old age people. So again, it becomes a moral obligation for the state to support and care for the elderly segment of the society. Then we have Section 20 of the Hindu Marriage and Adoption Act. Now this makes an obligatory provision with respect to the care and support given to the senior citizens. Then we have Section 125 of the CRPC, which basically talks about that these elderly people, the senior citizens, they can claim the maintenance from their children or from their near and dear ones. Then we have the maintenance and welfare of the parents and senior citizens, which is just talked about at the beginning of the discussion. This provides the overall statutory framework, the legal framework with respect to providing or promoting the interests of the senior citizens. So again, a very important aspect. Now, what are the challenges being faced by the elderly population in India? The very first is social challenges. That is, I'm looking at the social aspect of it. Social neglect. What we are witnessing in the same article is that the elderly people, they are being neglected. They are being abused. They are being exploited. Why? See, there has been, as I told you, change is the law of nature. There has been a change in the society. We are basically adopting more of Western values. The families are going from the system of joint families to the nuclear families. More of Westernization. So that had a negative influence on the overall structure. And therefore, what we are witnessing is social neglect. Then we have abuse of the elderly population. When I'm talking about the abuse, I'm not just referring to the aspects of financial abuse, right? It also includes the physical abuse, the emotional abuse, the mental abuse, sexual abuse, right? So they are basically being abused in different dimensions. Feminization of aging, very important point. What you have to understand is, since we have the females who have a higher life expectancy, there is a kind of feminization of aging which we are witnessing. And these females, since they have lesser education, since they do not have the decision-making power, they are more prone to all these issues. That is the abuse or neglect, sexual exploitation. So this is again a very serious concern. Next, we can have the economic and financial challenges. The very first is lack of income and poor financial status. We have the Pension Fund Regulatory Development Authority, PFRDA, which in its particular report of the year 2021, which highlighted this grave concern, said that the senior citizens in India do not have enough social security measures, primarily in the form of the pensions. Also, we have had the India Aging Report of 2023, which said that almost 18.7% of these elderly population, they have no income source of their own. Can you imagine? Almost 20% of these elderly people do not have any income of their own. They are primarily dependent. And ultimately what happens in poor families, or in fact even in rich families, they are then abused. The next aspect is low funding by the government. See, in developed countries, what we see is that there is a very robust social security architecture when we talk about the pensions or the health services. But in a developing country like India, where we have competing priorities, see, the government, we cannot always blame the government. Government has its own things to do. It has competing priorities. So what the research have shown is that the government of India spends less than 1% of GDP on the overall pensions. Now, this is a very small amount, because if you compare with the developed countries like US or Canada, you will see that this contribution towards the overall pension, overall social security net is way too much, right? So this is a very serious concern. Lack of housing and other basic amenities. First of all, these people do not have adequate provisions for their own, do not have these houses, and even if they have these houses or their living spaces, they do not suit their needs. That is a very serious issue. So this points towards the overall deplorable condition of the elderlies. Then there are health issues and other challenges. See, what we are seeing is that as people age, there is the rise in different diseases, primarily the non-communicable diseases. For example, you have diabetes, you have cardiovascular diseases, right? You have the other disease like hypertension. Now, this becomes an added burden on the overall health of this particular segment of the society. We have the multi-morbidity. For example, the report, the Longitudinal Aging Survey of India, last year report of 2021, says that almost 75% of the elderly population has one or more chronic disease. 3/4 of the total elderly population. And it also says that one in five suffers from a serious mental health disorder. So this is a very serious issue. Next, we have the increasing need for geriatric care. See what we are trying to say. We are not just talking about the out-of-pocket expenditure, the expenditure borne by the individual. We're not just talking about that. We're talking about the overall expenditure. See, once there would be a transition towards the rising share of the elderly population, the government would have to come up with its own provisions for this segment of the society. And therefore, there would be an added burden on the state exchequer with respect to providing the healthcare services. Now, if I want to spend more of resources, I'll have to divert it from the other sectors. So that would lead to the diversion of resources towards this particular segment of society. So there is an increased healthcare cost which is associated. Now, what have been different government initiatives? Very, very important. Keep these points in mind. We have had the very important policy, the National Policy for Older Persons 2011. Just remember, it has three primary goals. The very first is that it encourages the individuals that please make provisions for yourself with respect to your future. Secure your future. Second, what it says is that there has to be a robust participation of the non-governmental organizations in the overall healthcare setup. Third, what it says is that there has to be a focus upon providing the healthcare services to the elderly population. So these 3 points are what the main objective of the NPOP. Next, we have the Indira Gandhi National Old Age Pension Scheme in order to provide the pension to the segment of the below poverty line, above 60 years of age. We have this particular scheme. Then we have Rashtriya Vayashri Yojana. We have different physical aids. We have the assisted living devices. In order to provide these physical aids and assisted living devices to the elderly segment, we have this particular Yojana, which is Rashtriya Vayashri Yojana. Then we have Pradhan Mantri Vaya Vandana Yojana. Again, a reformed version, a kind of a revamped version, a more better version of the Indira Gandhi National Old Age Pension Scheme, so as to provide the pension to this particular segment of society. Then we have Senior Care Aging Growth Engine, SAGE Initiative and SAGE Portal. See, we have some of these startups who are working in coming up with those products and services which are made for this particular segment of society, the elderly population, right? So in order to incentivize these startups so that they can be given proper hand-holding or the financial support, we have this particular initiative and the SAGE portal. Now, what should be the way forward? The very first is transforming the perception of the elderly. See, you have to understand that whenever we have, the kind of perception we have with respect to the elderly population is that of a kind of a liability. That has to change because they have huge things to offer. They can make contributions to the society, right? So they should be taken as a kind of an asset, not as a liability. The perception has to change. The behavioral change has to be there. And building the elderly inclusive society. What do I mean by that? Old age homes. We often say that these people who are not being taken care of, they can be sent to old age homes. These old age homes need to be made more robust. Adequate finances should be given to these old age homes. But that is not the solution. We should basically reduce the number of these old age homes because the primary responsibility of the care lies with the families themselves. If we will give too much impetus upon opening these old age homes, definitely we will not be able to solve this particular problem. So for that, first we need a behavioral change, and then we need to understand that ultimately it is a responsibility of the family, not these old age homes. Then we have the formalization of the caregiving economy. Very, very important points. You must be aware of what is caregiving economy. According to the Niti Aayog, what it says that, if we have a proper structure of the caregiving economy, if the hospital visits can be basically substituted by the care at home, then it would reduce the overall hospital visits by almost 65% and the overall cost by 20%. What do you mean by that? for those services, for those areas where we can just provide these services at the home itself. There is no need to go to the hospitals. That would reduce the overall visits by almost 65% and the overall hospital costs by almost 20%. So this is very, very important. Now, when we are talking about the caregiving economy, we need to understand, we need to have a proper formalization. That is the next point. Now, how to formalize the caregiving economy? By focusing upon the comprehensive policy on home-based care. When we are talking about the home-based care, there has to be the organized structure of the home-based care. That is, there have to be proper nomenclatures of the jobs which can be offered. There has to be a particular career progression in this particular domain. So there has to be the formalization of this particular domain. Then we have the awareness with respect to the maintenance and welfare of parents and senior citizens. See, in this article itself, we talked about this particular act, the statutory framework. The point is that very few people are aware with respect to the kind of rights they have. The senior citizens, the rights they are having with respect to the maintenance, their maintenance, they're not even aware of that. So awareness is very, very important with respect to this particular statutory framework, which deals with the proper support and maintenance of the elderly sections. Then we have strengthening the pension system. Very, very important. As I told you, almost 19% of the elderly population, they have no income source of their own. So they are primarily dependent, even for their basic needs, for their food. So we need to come up with a robust pension system, because in order to make sure that they are not dependent upon anyone. So the government needs to invest more, need to spend more. The expenditure with respect to the pensions has to increase from the side of the government. Very important. Then replication of Switzerland Time Bank initiative. A very quite good initiative in Switzerland. What happens here is that you have the younger population who basically takes care of the senior citizens or the people who are ill, who are sick, and then their all time is added up. Now, when these people age or when they fall ill, they can basically claim that amount of time, that we need care for this amount of time. That is a kind of a time bank initiative of Switzerland that can also be replicated. So what we are trying to say is that, first of all, this transition is real in the demography. There is going to be the increased proportion of the elderly in the population. Second, that this particular segment is subject to a lot of neglect, exploitation, abuse. So adequate measures need to be taken. Next aspect is, when we talk about the pension systems, they have to be increased. There have to be stricter provisions with respect to this particular act. Possibly an amendment can come to this particular act. Right? And ultimately, what we have to understand, we should not treat this particular section as a liability. That is what you have to understand. Let's have a means practice question. India's aging population is rapidly growing, creating new challenges for the social welfare systems. Discuss the need for elderly care in India, the challenges associated with it, and the measures that should be taken to ensure their well-being. 15 marks, 250 words. Do write a particular answer on this question. And yes, if you're liking the initiative, do not forget to press the like button and let us know through the comments as well. Let's go to the next topic. Coming to the next topic, this is with respect to industrial and chemical disasters. With the increasing pace of industrialization, what we are witnessing is the increasing cases of industrial and chemical disasters. And this is despite the fact that we already have a very robust legal structure. The prime reason that why we are having the increased instances of these disasters is because of the human errors, the neglect of safety protocols. And ultimately, what we are having is the loss of lives and property. In this particular case, we have 2 miners who have succumbed because of the CNG cylinder blast in a godown. Just before a few months, we had a particular case in SEZ in Andhra, where almost 70 people died. And if I remember, we had a particular case in Dombivli last year, where there was a boiler blast and many people succumbed. So this is a very serious public safety issue from the perspective of disaster management. Now, what are these industrial chemicals? See, these industrial chemicals, they form the core of modern industrial systems. And according to some research, they basically contribute to almost 7% of India's GDP. These industrial chemicals, which form the backbone of the overall processes in the industries. Now, what we see is that these industrial or chemical disasters or catastrophes, they are relatively avoidable. But they happen primarily because of human errors. And they hamper the overall industrial progress and development. Next aspect is that they cause a significant loss. When we talk about the human lives, when we talk about the overall systems, the property, right? So again, a very serious issue. Now, if you go into the data and the overall structure, what you will find is that according to the National Disaster Management Authorities, almost more than 130 chemical disasters have taken place in the country in the last 1 decade. And more than 300 people have lost their lives in these disasters. Now, what NDMA does is it basically looks into certain areas, what it calls as the Major Accident Hazard Units, MAH units. It has identified almost 1861 MAH units across 301 districts. But does it mean that the risk is only involved in these places? The answer is no. For the other places, what we have is the hazardous factories and unorganized sectors. You have certain areas which are registered, which are not formal. So over there also we have a huge disaster risk. But that is not which is featured in the MAH units of the NDMA. That is what you have to understand. Now, what have been the different causes of chemical disasters in India? The very first is technical failures. See, in the industry, we have a particular process which has to be followed. There are protocols, but generally what we see is because of the haste, because of the increase of production, the urge to increase the production, these protocols are not followed. Let's say you have certain protocols with respect to the assembly lines, they're not followed, and it might lead to a disaster. Then there can be the issues that proper ventilation is not there. There is the accumulation of heat, and ultimately there is a fire. So these are the systems. Next, we have the human errors. Again, proper follow-up of the protocols is not being taken place. People are not being given the adequate PPE kits. So they are very important. They're indispensable for having a proper robust structure. They're not being given these kits. So this is again a very serious issue. Hazardous waste processing and disposal. Every industry produces some kind of waste which is hazardous in nature. Now, when we talk about the storage and processing of this waste, this is not carried out effectively. And in fact, the people in the vicinity, the people who are living, they are not even aware of that we have a particular industry which is producing such a kind of product and such a kind of waste. So this is a very serious concern. Induced effect of natural calamities. Let's say you have a particular industrial setup with its all pipes and equipments, and suddenly there is an earthquake, or suddenly there is a flooding. This can lead to the breakage of the pipes, the breakage of the assembly lines, and this might lead to the emission of these dangerous chemicals in the overall environment, and this can lead to the death of many people. So it can also be because of the natural calamities. Then you have the sabotage or terrorist attack. We have the anti-social elements, right? So they can basically perpetrate a particular act and lead to this particular situation, and this might lead to the loss of lives of humans. What have been the major chemical disasters in India? So if I look at the Bhopal gas tragedy of 1984, we had the Union Carbide factory, which was producing the methyl isocyanate. Now this basically leaked into the environment because of the neglect, because the protocols were not followed by the owners of this particular company. And this led to the death of thousands of people. Thousands of people were crippled. They had genetic disorders. Then we had the Chasnala mining disaster of 1975. We had this particular mine in Jharkhand, and there was the release of methane. Suddenly this methane got ignited. There was a very huge explosion, and ultimately led to the death of more than 700 people. Then we had the disaster in Korba chimney in 2009, where there was a particular boiler blast, and more than 50 people, they succumbed. So these instances have shown that there have been the neglect, there are loopholes in the overall management of the industrial processes. Now, let's talk about the legal and regulatory framework in India. See, we have certain sector-specific areas. For example, we have the Explosive Acts, Petroleum Acts, we have the Factories Act, Insecticide Acts. When we look at these 4 acts, they deal with a particular sector. So they have certain aspects of general legislation, and they have certain aspects of sector-specific legislation. So they regulate these particular sectors, be it the explosives or the petroleum or different factories. Then we have the Environment Protection Act of 1986. Again, a very, very important act. When we look at from the angle of the disaster, what you have to understand is that this gives power to the union government, that it can come up with those rules and regulations which have to be followed by these industries with respect to the safety standards. Then we have the Public Liability Insurance Act of 1991. The victims of these disasters, this particular act provides the relief and compensation to the victims of different disasters. Then we have the National Green Tribunal Act. so as to provide for the expeditious and speedy process of the justice delivery in these environmental cases. Then we have the Disaster Management Act of 2005. This was legislated aftermath the tsunami of 2004. Now, this provides the overall structure, the overall framework with respect to the disaster management in the country. Includes the 3 tiers. We have the center, we have the state, we have the district administration. So again, provides a collaborative approach, a proper approach with respect to the disaster management. Now, we also have certain rules. Why we have rules? Because these rules, they basically reinforce the statutory structure. We have the manufacture, storage, import of hazardous chemicals rules of 1989. Then we have the chemical accident rules, so as to prevent or if a particular accident takes place, how to basically manage that. Then we have hazardous waste rules. Then we have the gas cylinder rules, again sector specific. Now, what have been the guidelines with respect to the chemical disaster management by the NDMA? See, we have these guidelines which are holistic in nature. They provide for a general summary of how the protocols need to be followed. What should be the importance of the safety standards which are to be maintained by different industries. So again, provides a very all-encompassing, comprehensive approach with respect to the disaster management. Then it is based on proactive and participatory approach. See, it is not just including a particular set of government. It includes the union government, it includes the different departments of the union government, state governments. So it is a multi-stakeholder approach, what you have to understand, and a proactive approach. See, what we have seen is when we talk about the disaster management, we earlier had a particular approach of a reactive approach. Disaster has happened, now we are reacting. But what this particular guidelines emphasize upon the fact is that we need to have a proactive approach. Before the disaster occurs, we need to have these standards which the industries should follow, so as to minimize disaster risk. Then we have the National Action Plan on Chemical and Industrial Disaster Management. Again, a very comprehensive aspect, provides the holistic approach and then also includes multiple stakeholders. What should be the way forward to avert and mitigate such disasters? The very first is implementation and efficacy of laws. I already told you, we have so many of these laws and rules. But the point is that they are not being followed in letter and spirit. And many times what we have seen is that there is this particular nexus, illicit nexus between the administration and these industry. So again, see, these safety protocols or safety standards, they require some form of capital investment. And these owners, they're not really inclined to invest in the safety aspect. So what they do is they basically bribe these officials. So there is this illicit nexus, we have to break this. Then we have buffer zones around the factories. Very, very important. In many of the cases, what we have found is that the people who are living in the nearby adjoining areas, the vicinity, they're not even aware that we have such a dangerous industry producing such a dangerous chemical, or let's say the waste. So they need to be given proper information that the kind of industry we have in this particular area. And again, we need to construct a buffer zone so that it basically make sure that it secures the people living in the adjoining areas. Regular safety drills and training, including the people living in the adjoining areas. Local population must be made aware. Safety audits, very, very important point. When we are talking about the safety audit, what I'm trying to emphasize upon is third-party safety audit. That is, it should be all-inclusive. It should be done in an impartial manner so that we can make sure that the kind of recommendations which this particular board gives, the safety audit boards, it has to be basically implemented by the respective industries. Again, very important. And the industries should also be penalized if they're not following. Then retrofitting of the industrial equipments and storage. On the basis of the reports, on the basis of studies, if a particular board comes to the conclusion that it has to be retrofitted, then definitely it should be done so as to make it more robust, so as to make it more secure, even with respect to the natural calamities like earthquake or let's say the urban flooding. So this is what you have to understand, a very serious issue, because what we are seeing is the number of instances has been increasing continuously and it has led to the loss of lives of many and again loss of property also. Let's have a mains practice question. Despite having a robust legal and institutional framework, industrial chemical disasters continue to pose serious risks in India. In the light of this statement, critically examine the causes, the challenges in managing the chemical disasters, suggest a comprehensive strategy for the prevention, preparedness and mitigation. 15 marks, 250 words. Do write a particular answer in this question. Let's go to the next section. Coming to the simplified section, we have the first topic which basically poses the question: is India the world's 4th largest economy? See, let's talk about the gist of the article. We have this economic concept of GDP, gross domestic product. What it means is the value of all goods and services produced within the country, within a certain period of time. Now, that is the concept of GDP. Now, if I were to compare the GDP of India with that of the other country, how it can be done? It can be primarily done in two ways. First, on the basis of the normal exchange rate, right? Let's assume that the GDP of India is almost 300 trillion, for example, right? 300 trillion. And let's assume that you have $1, which is equal to almost 75 Indian rupees, right? So if I want to basically convert it into dollars, what I'll do is I'll divide by 75 and I'll get a number, 4 trillion US dollars, right? So this is the GDP based upon the exchange rate. The second basis is on the purchasing power parity. What it means, first of all, see, let's say you want to purchase a meal, and let's say the meal in India costs rupees 100, right? Let's say it's 100 rupees. And the same meal in US, let's say it costs around $10 because of the higher inflation or the other factors over there. Now, 100 is almost $1.33 US dollars. Rupees 100 is almost equal to 1.33 US dollars. So what we see is that the purchasing power of Indian rupees is more, because the same meal which is costing 100 rupees in India, it is costing almost $10 in US. So if you were to adjust this aspect, what we have is purchasing power parity. When we look at this particular concept, what we see is that the GDP of India, especially of developing countries, it far more increases in comparison to that of the exchange rate. The third point which the author is talking about is that it's fine that India is going to emerge as a fourth largest economy. It's fine. But does the GDP measures some of the very important aspects of the overall economy? Does it measure the wide prevailing inequality? Does it measure the health status of the individuals or the social aspects of education? Right? So this is a very serious question. The article is very simple in nature and it gives the information and it talks about all these points which I've just told you. Let's start. So we have had discussions over the last week with respect to the size of the India's economy relative to the other economies in the world. We are having a comparative analysis. These discussions were based upon the new estimates of the GDP of various countries for 2024 by the International Monetary Fund and its annual projections from 2025 till 2030. As per these projections, what it says is India's GDP in 2025 was likely to be 4,187 billion US dollars, which will be marginally higher than that of the Japan, which is at present at fourth position. So India's position would then basically move to that of fourth. Thus, all probability, India will be the fourth largest economy of the world after US, China and Germany, right? Now, again, the government has credited to its own efforts and said it's primarily because of the leadership which has been provided by Prime Minister Modi. Now, the GDP of a country tells us very little about how its people live and work, how healthy and educated the people are, and how unequally its aggregate income is distributed. The income inequalities prevailing in the society. So it does not speak about all those important factors. GDP estimates miss out on measuring several crucial aspects of economic activity. For example, the unpaid work of women. We have our mothers and sisters who basically do a lot of domestic works. What about the valuation of the work which is basically being contributed by them? So it does not take into consideration that aspect. Hence, there have been repeated calls to revise the national account systems and end the predominant use of GDP to assess everything and use other indicators that allow us to study the socio-economic achievements better. Right now, the kind of framework we have with respect to the national money, right, the national income, that is just focused upon the economic aspect. What we are saying is broaden it, make it more broad and include the social aspects also, right? Comparison of the GDP sizes across countries is a complex effort. International organizations and economists have spent decades trying to perfect a robust methodology for these comparisons. Consequently, there is no single GDP estimate for countries. To compare, one needs the GDP estimates of all countries to be in one common unit. We cannot compare US dollar with that of the Indian rupees. We'll have to first convert the GDP of India in Indian rupees to US dollar, or let's say some other currency, right? So it has to be in one particular unit. This common unit is the US dollar. There are two ways of converting GDP estimates in national currency to GDP estimates in US dollars. First, we can use the market exchange rate. For example, we have the exchange rate as of now, for example, 85.69 according to the author. So you can just divide the number, the overall Indian rupees, the GDP, by this particular number and get it in the US dollars. Get a GDP estimate in US dollars. According to the GDP estimates based on the market exchange rates, India was ranked the 5th largest economy from 2021. You can just see we have the particular data provided by the author itself, and this is from different sources. You can just see it is projected that by 2025 India's position would be that of the 4th, and we have Japan, which would then go to the 5th position. The IMF projects that India will be the 4th largest economy in 25 and 3rd largest economy in 28. The US is ranked 1st and China is ranked 2nd. It is globally accepted that the conversions based on market exchange rates are robust only when the outcomes are closely linked to the prevailing exchange rates. So you can just see it's being projected that it would basically go to the 3rd position. The PPP comparison, which we discussed. When we try to compare the GDP sizes, market exchange rates deliver poorly. Market exchange rates are highly volatile. Market exchange rates do not work well when purchasing powers of people are different between the countries. For example, the price of a beer in New York may be $5 US, but only $150 in Mumbai. The price of a Big Mac meal in McDonald's may be $12 US in New York, but only about 385 in Mumbai. So there's a difference. If you just convert $12 in Indian rupees, that would be quite a much great amount, right? So you have to consider the purchasing power of the respective currencies. Thirdly, the prices of non-traded goods tend to be far cheaper than the traded goods in developing countries. The price of a haircut in New York may be $30, but only about 200 in Mumbai. The differences across the countries arise primarily because the wages and prices are lower and many non-traded sectors are labor intensive. The second method is used to convert the national currencies into dollars, the purchasing power parity exchange rates, where PPP stands for purchasing power parity. Here the exchange rates are used to equate the cost of a typical basket of goods across the countries. When converted to the international dollars based on PPP exchange rates, the estimates of GDP for the developing countries where prices are relatively low would rise. So you will see again, in developing countries and least developed countries, the prices are generally lower. So you can, for a specific amount of that currency, you can buy a particular set of commodities. But the same set of commodity in developed countries, that would have a higher cost. So you'll have to adjust the purchasing power of that particular currency in this particular country with that of the other. In 24, the GDP of the US was 7.5 times higher than that of India's GDP if the market exchange rates were used, but it was only 1.8 times higher than the India's GDP if the PPP exchange rates was used. If PPP-based GDP estimates are used, we have different figures which are coming. India had already become the world's 3rd largest economy in 2009. So if you were to look at the PPP, we already became the 3rd largest economy in 2009 and has retained the rank for the past 16 years. So you can just see we have constantly from 2009 onwards, we have been at the 3rd position. We have the red, which talks about the PPP, and we have the nominal exchange. IMF's PPP-based projections do not show any improvement in India's rank between 24 and 30. Improving the comparisons, there is no doubt that the PPP method allows for a better comparison because we are basically looking at the purchasing power. So definitely it allows for a more broadened aspect of GDP measurement. Allows for a better comparison of GDP sizes than the market exchange rates. PPPs are used precisely because the developing countries have lower wages and hence lower prices and incomes than the developed countries around the world. Now, in addition, the countries like India have a large informal sector which is marked by severe underemployment and large number of unpaid female workers. In other words, the poorer and the more underdeveloped a country is, the larger will be its inflation of GDP via the PPP route. India has a GDP size, a large GDP size, but it is also host to the world's largest population. That is, you have to consider. So when we are having, in absolute terms, we may have a large GDP, but when we have a large population, the per capita is lower. Per person, the value, the overall GDP becomes lower. So that has to be looked into account. The per capita GDP of India was almost $2,711 in 24 in current dollar terms, which places it at the lower end of the list of lower middle income countries. Even in the list of lower middle income countries, even the lower end. In the same year, the per capita income in Sri Lanka was almost $4,325 and Bhutan was almost $400. 4,000 US dollars. In 91, India had a higher per capita of 304 US dollars than Vietnam. At that time, Vietnam had almost 141 US dollars. By 24, Vietnam's per capita had grown to almost 4,536. Look at the kind of progress these East Asian countries have made. They have become the manufacturing grounds for the most of the multinational brands, be it Adidas, be it the other brands. So again, quite an inspiring position. While India's per capita GDP languished at almost 2,711. Even in terms of PPP international dollars, India's rank in per capita in 24 was 127th among the 196 countries. India's large GDP size has very little to do with the well-being of its people. A much better way, now this is a kind of a way forward which you can imagine, of knowing if India is more developed or less developed than the US, China, Japan or Germany might be to compare the set of indicators across them that help meaningfully measure the economic performance and social progress. So we are just looking at the economic aspect, and once you do it per capita, also it becomes lower. So also include the social dimensions of the progress, right? Indicators that signify the fundamental elements of life and work that citizens care about, be it health, education. These aspects need to be incorporated in the overall measurement of the GDP. That is what the authors are talking about. Let's go to the next topic. Coming to the next topic, this is with respect to the regulation of virtual digital assets. Let's talk about the gist of the article. First of all, what is virtual digital assets? You must have heard about the cryptocurrencies, for example, the bitcoins, or the CBDC, central bank digital currencies. In the form of, in India's case, we have the e-rupee. Or let's say it is tokens or NFTs, non-fungible tokens, or stable coins. All these are virtual digital assets. Now, what you have to understand is, the benefit of using these VDAs is that, first of all, it is decentralized in nature. Second, it offers the ownership rights. And it cannot be tampered with easily. Because the kind of technology we use is that of the blockchain in most of these systems. Now, in India's case, what you have to understand is that the government was not really inclined to have the trading of these cryptocurrencies in the Indian setup. So it was in 2018 that the Reserve Bank of India came up with a particular circular saying that the financial institutions are not allowed to trade these cryptocurrencies. And in 2020, the Supreme Court basically overturned this particular order. Now, as a countermeasure, what the government said was that we are going to have a lot of taxations on these VDAs. Prohibitive taxation was applied. But again, what ultimately happened, there was a bypass route taken by these traders or retail investors. So now what they're doing is they're using the virtual private networks, VPNs, and then they're accessing these non-compliant platforms. So what the author is trying to say is that in this particular situation, the importance of VASPs, virtual asset service providers, becomes very, very important. Now the government should come up with a proper regulatory structure. It cannot basically stop, because what we are witnessing is a booming sector. We have people who are basically using the illicit means to basically invest in cryptocurrencies, using VPNs, prohibited websites, using those non-compliant platforms. So what the author says is that we need to come up with a proper regulatory structure, and over here, VSPs play the very important role. This is what you have to understand. Let's talk about the different types of digital assets. I've already told, we have the cryptocurrencies, digital currencies that are cryptographically. So this is an encryption technique secured by the blockchain. So you have the necessary usage of the blockchain, right? So it basically makes the whole system foolproof. NFTs, non-fungible tokens, blockchain-based tokenized assets that cannot be replaced. For example, let's say you have a painting. So you can generate an NFT for that particular painting, and there would be only one owner of that, right? A unique system. Stable coins, digital currencies tied to a currency, tokens, assets that have been tokenized on the blockchain. Then we have digital bonds. Bonds that are issued and traded and settled online via the blockchain. CBDC, digital currencies linked to the value of the issuing nation's official currency. E-rupee, for example, in India's case. Advantages: decentralized ownership rights, speedy transactions because they happen on an online basis. Public systems cryptographically secure. The encryption is very strong. Semi-autonomous asset ownership. Then disadvantages: highly volatile, prone to volatile markets, right? Prone to scams, cybersecurity risk, regulatory uncertainty. Because again, in India's setup, we are not having a particular regulatory environment for these assets. So therefore, there is uncertainty which is involved. technical complexities, and no room for errors. Now, what these VSPs, virtual asset service providers, do: exchange between the virtual assets and fiat currencies, exchange between one or more types of virtual assets, service related to the transfer of virtual assets, saving or managing virtual assets as a custodian. So they are basically providing the services with respect to these virtual assets. That's what you have to understand. Key roles: exchanges, wallet providers, custodians, and payment processors. Let's look at this particular article. NASSCOM reports finds that National Association of Software and Services Companies that the Indian retail investors poured almost $6.6 billion in the crypto assets and predicts the industry could create over 8 lakh jobs by 2030. $6.6 billion and so many jobs. Still, the government is not inclined to have a particular structure, and see, again, they have their own reasons for it. The vibrancy may seem surprising given the rocky journey of crypto known as virtual digital assets in India. In May 25, the Supreme Court of India questioned the absence of a comprehensive and clear crypto regulation in India with a remark: banning may be shutting your eyes to the ground reality. You may ban the whole system, but it is already undergoing. In fact, it is thriving, right? So people are using non-compliant platforms. So you have to basically come up with a robust regulatory structure. This highlights the dissonance between the VDA reality and VDA policy, significant challenges for regulators and market players. Navigating India's VDA regulatory gaps. India, a country of strict capital controls and tightly regulated payment systems, has found difficult to reconcile these frameworks with the decentralized nature of VDAs. So again, the government is not really inclined to favor these VDAs. The Reserve Bank of India, domestic regulator of monetary policy, began expressing concerns about the potential threats of crypto as early as 13, highlighting the risk associated with their lack of authorization from any central bank. So what the government says is that there has to be a regulatory structure coming from the central bank itself. Despite this, the market saw unassailed growth, and therefore it forced the Reserve Bank of India to issue a circular in 2018 barring the financial institutions from dealing with the VDA related entities. This was overturned by the court in 2020. Then the government basically started the prohibitive taxation policies as a stopgap measure. Although these measures were designed to enhance the transparency and curb the speculation, their effectiveness has been limited. Now, the different estimates what they say is between July 22 and December 23, Indians traded over 1.03 trillion worth of VDAs. Can you imagine? Almost 1 trillion rupees, despite these regulatory aspects, on non-compliant platforms. Offshore trading resulted in a loss of almost 2,488 crore in uncollected VDA tax revenue. So if this was formalized, the government could have earned this much amount of money, right? But this has been done. The trading has been done through non-compliant platforms. Cumulative uncollected TDS from the offshore exchanges since July 22 is estimated to exceed 60 billion rupees. Efforts to block access to the non-compliant platforms such as URL blocking had limited success. You can block the URL, but that can be accessed through the VPNs. That's the issue. Users continue to bypass the restriction using the virtual private networks, mirror platforms, or servers by migrating to other non-compliant exchanges. What would be the role of these VSPs? Guidelines by the global standard setting bodies such as IMF or FATF or Financial Stability Board converge in favor of comprehensive and risk-based regulation. Right? You cannot just stop the sector from growing. There should be a particular regulatory structure, not a complete ban, that is harmonized with the international standards. However, these frameworks and regulations rely on domestic compliant intermediaries. So we need to have these intermediaries who provide the services with respect to these VDAs, known as the virtual asset service providers, that act as the bridge and eyes for the regulators. These intermediaries facilitate the alignment of VDA industry with the existing laws and enforcement of policies. So they ensure that we have the adherence to the different rules and regulations. Very important. In contrast, India's existing policy framework, which inadvertently pushes the VDA's users to offshore non-compliant platforms, erodes the country's ability to migrate the risk presented by these VDAs. In comparison, the Indian VASP platforms are sharpening their teeth, maturing rapidly, having shown a willingness to comply with the regulations. In collaboration with FIU India has been intelligence. Do read about this particular body, FIU India, Financial Intelligence Unit India. Tell me under which department it comes. Do mention in the comment section. Has been instrumental in strengthening the anti-money laundering and counter-terror financing control. See, the reasons why the government doesn't want basically to formalize this aspect is that these cryptocurrencies are also used for these anti-social activities. or they are basically a threat to the overall security of the country, be it the trafficking, drug trafficking, or the human trafficking, or even the money laundering aspects, promoting terrorism. So there is a valid ground on the aspect of the government also. The FATF, the aftermath of the devastating hack in 2024, which wiped almost 230 million US dollars, further showcased the proactive measures by Indian exchanges, enhancing cybersecurity measures, setting up the dedicated insurance funds in case of future thefts, and uniting to develop and enforce the industry-wide cybersecurity guidelines. So if, let's say, there's a question with respect to these cryptocurrencies, what way forward you can give? That is how you extract the information. Use these things. Enhance cybersecurity structure, right? That is really very important. Insurance facilities. Need for a framework. Signal the possibilities, signal the critical role played by the VSPs towards a safer digital asset ecosystem. Combined with the contributions to national value creation, platforms present a more viable and constructive channel for more funds to flow through under the oversight of Indian regulators. A balanced, pragmatic, and future-proof regulation is necessary. And it cannot be an outright ban. There has to be a proper regulation, decisive action to create the comprehensive legislation that crypto industry requires. So this is what you have to understand. There have to be a proper regulatory framework, not the outright ban, what the author is saying about. Let's go to the next topic. Coming to the next topic, here's a good news coming from Sariska Tiger Reserve, where a tigress has given birth to 4 cubs. So the news item says, in a boost to tiger conservation efforts in Rajasthan, a tigress at the Sariska Tiger Reserve. Since it has been there in the news, possibly a question can come with respect to Sariska Tiger Reserve. Has given birth to 4 cubs, taking the total number to 48. The tiger population in Sariska began to decline in 2002 due to the poaching. By 2004-2005, the sightings had nearly disappeared, prompting the authorities to take action. Several tigers have been translocated to Sariska from Ranthambore National Park since 2008 to repopulate it. Look at this particular map, very, very important, taken from the Government of India's website itself. We have the total numbers of tiger reserves in the country. Glance through it, download, read it, understand, right? So very important. So when we talk about Rajasthan, we have 4 tiger reserves: Sariska, Ranthambore, Ramgarh, and Mukundra Hills. Remember, these are important. The very first, Jim Corbett, right? So we have other, Simlipal, Satkosia. We have the Amrabad, Nagarjuna Sagar, Bhadra, Kali, Sahyadri. Very, very important. We have Dampa over here. And we have Pakke, Manas, Baksa. Please do refer and glance through this particular map. Now, what is a tiger reserve actually? So we have the Tiger Reserve, which is a designated area established under the Project Tiger initiative to ensure the conservation of tigers and their habitats. So this is a designated area which basically came through the Project Tiger. These reserves are a part of the government's effort to protect the tiger population, maintain the biodiversity, and the other conservation aspects. Tiger Reserve consists of extensive areas of land that include both the core zone and a buffer zone. Very important. The core area is designated as a national park or a sanctuary, providing strict protections for the wildlife. In contrast, the buffer zone is a mix of forested and non-forested land that serves various uses. Buffer zones act as transitional areas that support the wildlife movement. Then we have, presently there are 57 tiger reserves. Is it correct? No, there are 58. And you have to tell me which was the last tiger reserve which was added. The hint is that it is in the state of Madhya Pradesh. I want you all to answer it right in the comment section. Spread across the 82,000 square kilometers, accounting for almost 2.3% of India's geographical area. Important, as per the National Tiger Conservation Authority. But what is NTCA all about? So the NTCA is a statutory body. There can be a question in the prelims. Is it a statutory body? The answer is yes. Under the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, constituted under the provisions of Wildlife Protection Act. So it was constituted under the provisions of Wildlife Protection Act of 1972 for strengthening the tiger conservation as per the powers and functions assigned to it. The NTCA conducts the All India Tiger Estimation. So it is done by NTCA. In a cycles of 4 years, as per the 5th cycle summary of 22, India has a minimum of 3,167 tigers in and is home to more than 70% of the world's wild tiger population. What is the process of creating a tiger reserve? The state government identifies a suitable area. Tiger reserve based upon the presence of a viable tiger population and appropriate habitat. Ecological assessments are conducted. The studies, which include the study on the prey base, vegetation and other areas. The state prepares a DPR, detailed project report, that includes the map, ecological studies, management plans. Then it is submitted to NTCA. So it starts from the very state itself. which reviews and approves before it forwarding to the Union Ministry, before it approves and then forwards to the Union Home Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change for further consideration. Once this process is complete, the state government issues a preliminary notification under the Wildlife Protection Act of 72, declaring the identified area as a tiger reserve. After addressing any objections or the proposed modification, the state issues the final notification under Section 38 capital V of the Wildlife Protection Act, formalizing the establishment of the reserve. Notably, as per Section 38 W of the Act, once the notification comes, no state government shall denotify a tiger reserve except in public interest with the approval of the Tiger Conservation Authority and the National Board for Wildlife. So this is very important. Project Tiger, again, let's have a glance of it. Centrally sponsored scheme by the central government in 1973. In a bid to promote the conservation of tiger, the program came at a time when India's tiger population was rapidly dwindling, becoming less. According to the reports, while there were 40,000 tigers in the country at the time of the independence, they were soon reduced to below 2,000 by 1970. To tackle the problem of hunting and poaching of not just tigers but also other animals, then the Prime Minister Indira Gandhi promulgated the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972. Historical chronology is also important because sometimes we face difficulties in learning the materials. So once you have a chronology, it becomes easy for you to understand, right? A year later, after a task force urged the government to create a chain of reserves dedicated to the tiger preservation, government unveiled the Project Tiger, launched at the Jim Corbett National Park. The program was initially started in 9 tiger reserves. It was launched in Jim Corbett National Park of different states such as Assam, Bihar, Karnataka and others, covering over 14,000 square kilometers. So you have to understand there are total of 58 tiger reserves as of now. And the last one you have to tell me, which is in the state of Madhya Pradesh. Let's go to the next topic. Coming to the next topic, here is a particular news item with respect to a very important body, which is the International Atomic Energy Agency. The gist of the article is that you have the Iranian foreign minister who has said that if the European nations are going to reimpose the sanctions on Iran, then Iran is going to retaliate. That is what the objective is. Iran on Sunday warned that it would retaliate if European powers that have threatened to reimpose the nuclear sanctions exploit a UN report showing Tehran has stepped up the production of highly enriched uranium. So there have been allegations, especially by the Western countries and these European countries, that Iran is now basically enriching the uranium. So this is a security threat, right? The report by the International Atomic Energy Agency said that Iran had sharply increased its stockpile of uranium enriched up to 60%, close to the roughly 90% level needed for atomic weapons. Now, what is this IAEA? It's the world's foremost intergovernmental forum for scientific and technical cooperation in the nuclear field. It works for a safe, secure, and peaceful use of nuclear science. Then autonomous organizations within the United Nations. You have to understand this is an important point. It carries out the programs to maximize the contribution of nuclear technology in the society, widely known as the Atoms for Peace and Development. IAEA reports both to the UNGA and Security Council. The statute of the IAEA was approved in 1956 by the Conference on the Statute of the International Atomic Energy Agency, came into force in 1957. Headquarters, again important, Vienna in Austria. Membership, currently 178 member states. The General Conference, consisting of all members, meets annually to approve the budget and different programs, what the agency is going to do in the coming year. The Board of Governors, which consists of 35 members who meet about 5 times per year, is charged with carrying out the agency's statutory functions, approving the Safeguards Agreement and appointing the Director General. The day-to-day affairs of the IAEA are run by Secretariat, which is headed by the Director General. So this is the kind of governance process of IAEA. It works with the member states and multiple partners worldwide to promote safe, secure, and peaceful use of atomic technologies, nuclear technologies, applies nuclear safeguards. So it goes for inspections. You must have seen that you have these sites being inspected. We also had this in Pakistan recently when India bombarded, many places in Pakistan. To verify that nuclear activities remain peaceful, in particular, the IAEA implements the Comprehensive Safeguard Agreement mandated by the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. IAEA assists the member states and promotes the exchange of scientific and technical information, enhances the national, regional, and international capacities to respond to nuclear and radiological incidents. So this is what you have to understand. Just know what the mandate of the body is, and just know that what are its functions, its constitution, where it is located, and that would be important from the perspective of the prelims. Let's go to the last article. So coming to the last topic of today's discussion, we have a joint naval exercise which is going to be conducted between Indian Navy and that of the European naval forces. So we have the Indian Navy and the European Union Naval Force will hold a joint exercise at the sea soon. The complex tactical exercises are aimed at enhancing the interoperability between the two sides and enabling the seamless operations when deployed for combating non-traditional, non-conventional threats, for example, piracy. The development was follow-up to the discussions between Prime Minister Modi and European Union President Ursula von Leyen, highlighting their shared commitment towards the international peace and security. Now, here is this opportunity to have a discussion with respect to different military exercises. Very, very important. Bilateral military exercises, we have Yuddha Abhyas between India and US, Malabar, India, US, Japan, Australia also, Ajay Warrior, India and UK, Garuda Shakti, India, Indonesia. Then we have Nomadic Elephant, India, Mongolia, Indra, India, Russia. Now, this is important. Dharma Guardian, India, Japan, and this is very important. Hand in hand, India and China. Important, do remember. Then we have multilateral military exercises. We have the SEO exercises. We have the RIMPAC, India as observer. We have Kafka's Russia-led multilateral. Vostok, again Russia. We have Cobra Gold, USA and ASEAN countries. India as observer. Exercise Tiger Trump, India and US. BIMSTEC military exercise. So these are multi-national exercises. Just keep a track of them. So that's it for today's discussion. I hope you really enjoyed the session. And if you did, do not forget to press the like button. All the very best. Thank you so much.